I think this is an easy one to understand, the connection between Watergate and Vietnam, but what's even more easier than this? What's going to happen in 1976? Gerald Ford is president after Nixon steps down. What's famous about Gerald Ford? I'm sure I've said this at least once or twice. Only a president never to be elected. Because remember, Nixon in 1972 was elected with a guy named Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew stepped down. Had nothing to do with Watergate. He had his own tax problems. He just stepped down. So they appointed Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford now is the vice president. He was appointed. He was elected. So when Nixon steps down, then who's the president? Gerald Ford, never elected. What's the likelihood of Ford winning in 76? Okay? And who wins? What's the role? You've got Ford, and I remember this. I was very young. And so all I remember, because I had no understanding of this, this is 1976, I was like 6. Okay. All I remember during the election is that they kept having Ford commercials. And somehow I thought that the guy who invented the Ford car is running for president. That's all I remember. That's it. Okay? Not very much. But Ford, and they did. They had Ford cars. And I remember watching it on television. Beyond that, I don't remember anything else. Carter. So Ford, not elected. He's an insider. He's been in Congress for a while. Football player, great. All that stuff, fun. What about Carter? What has he done? He is the governor of Georgia for how many terms? 1. How many times has he been into Washington, D.C.? He's not a Washington insider. Never been elected to Congress. Never been to Senate. He's basically just been in Georgia. Maybe he's in his second term. I can't remember precisely, but very little experience. And he gets elected. Why do you think he gets elected?
He's the opposite of Ford.
We had JFK. We had LBJ. We had Nixon. Different sides of the fence, and in some case, all 3 of these guys are totally different from each other. Well, what are they all? They are all very politically savvy. JFK knows how to use the media. LBJ's got this realignment thing. Nixon's got the other realignment. And what do we get? We get Watergate. What's the last thing we want when we elect a president in 1976? Political savvy. We want somebody who does nothing. Away from Washington, D.C. And really, you couldn't get a better guy than Carter to be someone who's got nothing. That's a terrible thing for me to say. But even Democrats look back and they don't like Carter. Okay. Carter gets elected in 1976. He is known by his own party, certainly by the Republicans, as being a little bit weak. I'm not going to get too much into the economics, except what you get is really high interest rates and low wage and high unemployment, which is because of the low wages. We call this something called stagflation. Now, theoretically, if you get high interest rates and you get high inflation, then you should also be getting high wages. If your bread costs $5 a loaf, then you should be making more money to be able to buy the $5 loaf bread. Usually what happens is you increase the money, then the inflation follows. Well, in this case, it was the opposite. Economy was terrible. We talked about foreign policy. Afghanistan's invaded. Iran has an overthrow government. They take hostages. And what does Carter do about it? Doesn't do very much. After a year, he has this really amazing plan where he's supposed to take these helicopters, fly over the city and gas everybody to sleep, and then these guys would be the only ones with gas masks. They would come and take the hostages and free them. It's kind of a little bit more complicated than you might think, and in fact, all the helicopters crashed in the desert long before they got to the city, so it was an utter embarrassment for Carter, which is because he had been pulling money out of the military for years, and so we're kind of underprepared. This is all embarrassing. So embarrassing that even the Democrats, Ted Kennedy, run against Carter. It's very rare for a sitting president to have somebody from his own party run against him. And they do. And so, he's kind of known for being weak. Why? Because after Watergate, what's the last thing we want? Now, the last little thing, we got 38 seconds here. He loses to who? And what's he usually known for being?
Movie stuff.
Movie star. Whether you agree with him or not, he is known as being a stronger president. And why do we have Reagan after Carter?
The opposite of Carter.
The opposite of Carter. Why do we have Carter after Nixon? And it all has to do with Watergate. So I put this up here. Can you see the connection? Is it possible to have a connection between these guys and this event? Yes. What are we going to talk about next week?
More about
Reagan?
Reagan.
I want to talk about Reagan, and I want to talk about the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? You guys?
Bad.